On December 9 in UN, 2 days before US Senate passed resolution that recognized as a genocide the mass killing of Armenians on the occasion of International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide and of the Prevention of this Crime, took place a roundtable discussion organized by the Permanent Mission of Armenia to the United Nations. The forum was titled Remembrance and Education as Powerful Tools for Prevention, Drawing Lessons to Address Changes. The program began with opening remarks by His Excellency Mr. Meher Markarian, Permanent Representative of Armenia to the United Nations.
4 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 69/323, which established the international day we are observing today. Since establishment in 2015, the International Day of the 9th December has served as key multilateral platform to raise global awareness about the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and to pay tribute to the memory and dignity of millions of victims of past atrocities. The Armenian nation has gone through the horrors of genocide in the beginning of the 20th century. Hence, Armenia bears special duty to consolidate international efforts aimed at prevention of the crime of genocide. We all know it too well that genocides do not happen overnight. They are usually preceded by a well-recognizable pattern of deterioration of human rights and fundamental freedoms, discrimination and stigmatization of vulnerable groups, cultivation of hate speech that bring about incitement of hate crimes on ethnic and religious grounds. The United Nations, with its elaborate human rights and prevention toolbox, can play a strong role in advancing early warning against genocide and other atrocity crimes. As the Nobel Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel has said, I quote, "To deny would be akin to killing victims a second time," unquote. Genocide prevention embraces a number of important elements. Today we are going to focus on the role of remembrance and education for the prevention of future atrocities. Remembrance and education are essential to the prevention of framework as they entail acknowledgement of the crime committed in the past as well as commitment for non-recurrence in future.
The forum was moderated by Dr. Simon Adams, Executive Director, Global Center for Responsibility to Protect.
And 4 months from now, we will commemorate the 105th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. On the 25th of April 1915, Armenians were targeted and killed during mass deportations. Armenian churches were destroyed or seized. Property was pillaged. Thousands of women were abducted. And these acts claimed over 1 million lives and led to the United Kingdom, France, and yet Russia in May of 1915 to accuse the then Ottoman Empire of committing crimes against humanity, which was actually the first time the term was used in attempting to understand atrocities in our modern age. Famously, it was while studying the atrocities inflicted upon Armenians, this had a profound effect on a young Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, the man who invented the word genocide and who dedicated the rest of his life to the drafting, adoption, ratification, and implementation of the Genocide Convention. That attempt to destroy the Armenian people was a genocide and should be officially recognized as such, in my own opinion, and I think the UN and all of its member states should name the crime. This is not just because genocide denialism is an unconscionable affront to the victims and to history, but because through recognition of the crime, we can help prevent its recurrence.
Panelists included Mr. Adama Deng, Special Advisor of the U.S. Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide.
Armenia has been a strong supporter of the Prevention of Genocide mandate. They played a key role in the adoption of the General Assembly Resolution 69/323 that established the International Day, which we commemorated this morning. They have also supported several resolutions on the prevention of genocide at the Human Rights Council, all of which have helped to bring attention to this important issue. The topic of this panel, remembrance and education as tools for prevention, is also very timely. Early this year, the Secretary General presented a report to the Human Rights Council at its 41st session on the prevention of genocide that had a particular focus on the role of education to prevent genocide and other atrocity crimes, by which I mean war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Dr. Henry Thorold, President of International Association of Genocide Scholars, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, Worcester State University, co-editor of Genocide Studies International.
And I think if we're going to talk about genocide, we really have to start by acknowledging that we're on a territory in a country that was formed through genocide and other mass atrocities against the indigenous population and through slavery of people from Africa. And I think it's important that we start with that recognition so that we know that we're all coming from a position, and I, as somebody from the United States, I'm coming from a position of being part of a perpetrator group. I also really want to praise the Republic of Armenia and its foreign ministry and particularly Ambassador Margarian for not just this particular event, but for a number of years now, pioneering a truly global effort to get discussions of genocide out of the different silos that they're in and really bring policymakers, academics, and others together to try to really create solutions to address the problem. There's been the Global Forum Against the Crime of Genocide series in Yerevan over the past now almost 5 years, which has been extremely important and successful, this event and others. I think that is of special note because it is easy for a country that represents a group of people who experienced genocide to focus just on that case, their own case. And I don't fault any victim groups that do that. Oftentimes they struggle against the forces, the legacy of genocide that means their very viability, their very existence remains in peril over the long period, decades and centuries going forward. However, I have long been struck by the capacity, particularly of victim groups, to take on the issues of other groups through a sense of solidarity. Not just other groups who've experienced genocide, but to really step forward against what they see as potential genocide. And I think the Republic of Armenia deserves praise for that. Again, it's easy to do what's in your own interest. It's a lot more to do something that you get there's no benefit, there's no payoff, except the commitment to human rights or a benefit for human rights in the world.
Dr. Joanna Wohlhard, Associate Professor, Clark University, Francis L. Hiadi School of Psychology, affiliated faculty member of the Strassler Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Director of Social Psychology PhD program, co-editor of the Journal of Social and Political Psychology, Vice President of an International Society for Political Psychology.
A second pitfall is the problem of emotional numbing and perceived helplessness in light of so much violence and need. So there's research by social psychologists showing that when people are exposed to information about higher numbers of victims and the severity of their suffering, they are less likely to respond to that need and to donate because it is simply emotionally overwhelming, and they protect themselves from that distress by turning away from it. People are also less likely to support reparations when they perceive these to be unfeasible in light of greater need of so many victim groups. So we can probably generalize these findings to genocide education and violence prevention more generally, and the trick is to teach about these things in a way that does not convey the message that the violence is so widespread and all over the world, and there's nothing we can really do about it given the scope of the problem. A third problem is that in commemorations as well as in education, there's always the problem of who is represented and who is left out, which victim groups receive acknowledgement and which don't, which have a museum, which don't, etc. And this kind of imbalance in acknowledgement through commemoration and education can result in what we call competitive victimhood, also competitive competition over recognition, which in turn creates hostility and prejudice between different victim groups. So one study demonstrated this in the context of Belgium, where different racial and religious minority groups resented the greater acknowledgement that the Holocaust received compared to the violence and atrocities committed against their group. And I've actually seen similar comments in qualitative studies I did among Armenian Americans. So in other words, education and commemoration has to be mindful of these dynamics and has to be more inclusive. However, overly inclusive representations can also create pitfalls and lead to false equivalence that ignores power differences and the scale of experiences of victimization. In Turkey, a common representation, also one expressed by Erdogan once, of the Armenian genocide was that it was around the First World War where all groups suffer, but this seemingly inclusive statement is, of course, a subtle form of denial. So we have to keep in mind, like Henry also said, that history books and other educational tools can also, through omissions, silences, misrepresentations, and overly inclusive portrayals of different victim groups, become subtle tools of denial.
Dr. Eric D. Waits, Distinguished Professor of History and former Dean of Humanities and Arts in the City College of New York.
So I asked my students, I have about 30 of them, how many of them knew anything, had heard about the Armenian genocide, and the class basically split down the middle. Half of them had heard something, and half of them had not heard anything, didn't even know that the Armenian genocide had happened. So what it is possible to do in a class like this is to integrate the history of the Armenian genocide into European and Eurasian history, indeed into global history, to make that tragic event not something that is isolated because it is a part, as we know, of other genocides and other crimes against humanity that have occurred and unfortunately are still occurring, as we've heard from our distinguished panelists. But that integration, I like to think, is as important as when one is able to devote much more time to the topic in courses on comparative genocides, in courses on Armenian or Middle Eastern history. I had to learn this myself. And I learned from the best people, scholars and teachers there are, pioneers in the study. And when I was at the University of Minnesota, that included, and again, the Armenians in the audience will know the names of Steve Feinstein, the late Steve Feinstein, and Tana Akçam, Joanna's colleague at Clark University. And I thank all, when I think how I encountered the Armenian genocide and brought it into my own teaching, I also think how important it is that Armenian communities and the Republic of Armenia have kept the issue front and center in educational programs, public programs, as we're having today, and many other events. From that basis and from the great scholars and historians from whom I've learned, we have now expanded dramatically the number of students who know about the Armenian genocide and other genocides.
The forum concluded with engaging in informative Q&A from representatives of different countries. Almost all participants uniformly agreed that killing of Armenians in Ottoman Turkey constituted as genocide. The Turkish representative read a pre-written statement saying that Turkey accepts that many Armenians living in Ottoman Empire were killed in clashes with Ottoman forces during World War I, but consents the figure and denies that killings were systematically orchestrated and constituted a genocide.
We, as the Turkish Republic, have called for the establishment of a joint historical commission in order to study the events of 1915 in a scholarly manner. This call remains valid. Scholarly research to be carried out by Turkish, Armenian, and international historians would play a significant role in shedding the light on the events of 1915 and an accurate understanding of history. It is with this understanding that we have opened our archives to all researchers. Today, hundreds of thousands of documents in our archives are at the service of historians. Today,
Can I ask you to wind up, please, sir?
please let me allow to finish the statement. Turkey is a co-sponsor of the landmark resolution that marks today. However, today, unfortunately, we have witnessed an astounding exploitation of an international platform such as UN on a matter that has no legal and historical basis. We are deeply disappointed that this was allowed so, on a day as meaningful as a day like this. Allow me to conclude by saying that there is no verdict of a competent court in this regard with regard to the 1915 events that establishes the crime of genocide. In other words, international law does not recognize 1915 events as genocide. On the contrary, European Court of Human Rights delivered a landmark judgment which stipulates that 1915 events constitute a legitimate subject for debate. Hence, the debate on the events that occurred in 1915 belongs to the realm of history, not politics.
Please bring your statement to a close.
Concluding. UN should not be a platform to advance a member state's agenda in contradiction to other member states based on disinformation and on a highly critical subject and the most serious crime such as genocide.
The Turkish statement stirred a wave of protest among participating Armenians in the audience, many of whom are children of genocide survivors.
I'm the daughter of an Armenian genocide survivor, and I want to say on behalf of my colleagues here that I am tired, really tired, of decades of denial, as we have just heard. And since we have such an elaborate and well-established set of authorities at the table, and as President Erdogan said in his recent arrival next to President Trump, that he has millions of documents that will show what was right and wrong during this period of time. Have we examined those documents? Have we compared them to what you all have studied? And what is the conclusion? Where do we stand in terms of who was right, who was wronged? And you are the authorities, so tell us, what do you think? Have you examined those tons of documents that President Erdogan points to?
The Turkish statement was condemned by the panelist, Dr. Henry Thurl, who called it denialism in action.
Well, first I want to thank the Republic of Turkey for giving us an illustration of genocide denial. I think that's really helpful. I don't want to engage in the debate about denial, but I think that can be very practical for us to understand this phenomenon is still very powerful. And I have to say, I speak on genocide all the time. I haven't had direct denial of the Armenian genocide in about 15 years, so thank you for doing that. I also want to recommend that you update your denial literature. You're probably 30 years out of date, despite some references. Some of the arguments that you're giving have been so repeatedly refuted. It's really, you've got to do work. You've got the resources. Please do that so we have some more substance. The last thing is a little more serious. I do want to say that there are many people in Turkey, intellectual, political leaders, activists, and so forth, who fully recognize the Armenian genocide. And contrary to what was said, many of them are in jail or have served time in jail for recognizing it. So I think the allegation or the claim of free speech in Turkey, I think we know the truth. To add to the comment from our representative from Cyprus, I think one point of education is that we shouldn't be talking about the Armenian genocide. We need to be talking about the genocide of Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians. That's where new research has gone. And that's one of the ways in which education can actually even help victim groups understand better their own experiences.
The importance of this forum cannot be underestimated, since to prevent future genocides, we must recognize and honor the past and make sure full justice is served for the victims of Armenian genocide. The forum concluded with a string quartet of classical music performed works by genocide survivor, legendary Armenian composer Komitas.